told us in his Bible meetings. What he did, he took Julie upstairs in his room and he pushed her on his bed and he raped her. He said to us that, that his dick was so hard. And he told us everything that what he did to her. He pushed his dick inside of her, and he said that he was very, very rough with her. And she was crying and crying and crying.
For entertainment, Koresh forced the Branch Davidians to watch violent and horrific videos, usually of films about the Vietnam War, to instill a militant and defensive mentality. Koresh had guns from the beginning, and he made his mighty men into trained marksmen.
His weapons were part of his message. You see, if there was going to be a war, and God's people had also to be warriors, and so there was that element of religion as well, that we had to be trained as warriors for the Lord.
On several occasions, they had displayed guns where people would back into their driveway or show some indication that they were going onto their property. Then guns were revealed, people coming out of the buildings out there with guns and what have you. There was some reference to it as being their country. I would not go out there onto their property without letting them have knowledge that I was coming to their property.
But of all Koresh's dubious activities, it was gun dealing that would bring him into conflict with authority. One of his members had a dealer's license and drove to cities like Houston to buy and sell at gun fairs. Koresh financed his sect by trading in weapons, a commonplace enough business in Texas. This was Koresh's business premises, a building near Mount Carmel called the Mag Bag. Here, Koresh took receipt of mail-order firearms from all over America, including machine guns like the AK-47, the simple kits that convert semi-automatic weapons into automatics, and even hand grenades. Fully assembled, they're all illegal. Only when a package burst open did the sheriff receive a tip-off from the Postal Service, UPS.
UPS called us one time on some hand grenade hulls, the kind that you would use set on your desk for paperweights. A box of them they were delivering they had damaged the box, and some of them had fallen out. And they called us to go out and look at them. They were not illegal, so we couldn't stop them from delivering them. And then we received information, black powder and other types of conversion kits for semi-automatic rifles to convert them to automatic rifles and that kind of thing. All this information we were giving to the federal people, ATF, who are responsible for investigating and controlling these kind of activities.
As a result, this house opposite Koresh's compound was occupied in January by agents of the Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms Bureau, the ATF. An agent called Rodriguez infiltrated Bible classes, and a log was kept of Koresh's movements. Warrants were issued to arrest Koresh and to search Mount Carmel for illegal weapons. Koresh used regularly to drive into Waco in his black sports car. He had no fear of arrest. Last week, a government report said that if the ATF had arrested Koresh in town, all the mayhem that followed need never have happened, and those who died might still have been alive. Instead, the ATF decided to mount its biggest ever raid. Over 100 armed agents set out for Mount Carmel. The raid was meant to have speed, simplicity, and surprise. Speed. The ATF agents were transported here in cattle trucks that were visible from miles away. Simplicity. The raid was preceded by 3 military helicopters that were fired upon before the cattle trucks even got here. Surprise. The raid had been talked about in Waco for days. The news media were alerted and were following the police convoy. One television news cameraman got lost near here and asked a postman for directions, adding, There's going to be a big gunfight with those religious nuts over there. The postman thanked him for the warning and drove back to Mount Carmel. He was David Jones, David Koresh's brother-in-law and one of the mighty men. Withering fire from the Davidians' automatic weapons greeted the ATF men when they tried to enter the building. Last week's report reveals that not only was Koresh forewarned of the raid, but the ATF's undercover agent Rodriguez had told that to the raid's commanders. The report says they should have called off the operation once the element of surprise was lost. With both sides suffering dead and wounded, Davidian lawyer Wayne Martin put in a desperate call to the deputy sheriff, Larry Lynch, who he knew. Against a background of gunfire, the call was recorded.
Yeah, this is Lieutenant Lynch. May I help you?
Yeah, they're shooting at us in Mount Carmel.
Mount Carmel?
Yeah, tell them there are children and women in here and to call it off.
God almighty. I can hear the bullets. God almighty, I knew this. Wayne?
Tell them to call it off!
Who is this, Wayne?
Tell them to pull back!
What?
They attack us with our fight to the last man! They started firing first! They want a ceasefire! We'll come! Oh, shit.
What's the matter?
What do you think? They're doing all this firing at us right now.
Okay. All right, I'm trying to make contact with the forces now. Stand by.
Why do you think such extreme violence was used against law enforcement officers when they arrived to carry out their duties?
Well, because it was provoked. Because the ATF provoked it. Violence begets violence. And when the ATF assaulted those people, they defended themselves.
When you think about 100+ people inside of a compound with all of those weapons, you need to amass a large-scale operation. The important thing was that it go forward only with the element of surprise. Unfortunately, the element of surprise was lost and the operation still went forward.
Ronald Noble's report concedes that with 4 ATF men killed and 16 wounded, the raid was a fiasco. But there could be no let-up now. Koresh was confronting not just the local sheriff, but the government of the United States. Federal officers were dead. A tragic process began to unfold, and faced with an intransigence they could not understand, officials made a series of misjudgments that would end in even greater loss of life. David Koresh and his followers were where they wanted to be, inside the fortress of Mount Carmel. They settled down for a long siege, and so did the outside world. President Clinton replaced the ATF with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. Meanwhile, the Army provided armored vehicles and helicopters. The aim was to get the Davidians to give themselves up, but over the succeeding weeks, only a handful came out. The rest chose to stay.
Anybody else want to look through the field glasses? It don't cost.
Last week's report for the Justice Department acknowledges that the FBI's tactics didn't work. Instead of a swift resolution, the siege dragged on into its second month. Initially, the FBI's fear was that there'd be a mass suicide. When Vicky Hollingsworth came out after 3 weeks, she confirmed that fear.
Yvette Fagan, she brought a green thing, a round thing, and she gave it to one of the ladies, I cannot remember which one, saying that, it's a grenade and it's going to be quick death.
Even in that early part of the siege, a decision had been made that you were all going to die.
That we're all going to die, and that they're going to blow the place up. So a mass suicide, the people were planning a mass suicide in the first few days of the siege.
Is this because David Koresh had persuaded everybody that their lives would have to end in this siege?
Well, David said that we were at the end. Everyone believed that that the time has come, that we was at the end of the world.
If that was the mood in the early days of the siege, later on the FBI knew Koresh's attitude may have changed. Koresh's lawyer, Dick DeGuerin, was one of the few the FBI allowed to speak to him. De Guerin gave Panorama evidence that Koresh intended to survive the siege, the tape of a phone conversation late in the siege that has not been heard publicly before.
This is where my focus is. But once I go out here, I want to go out walking. I told them, I had no intention of committing suicide. I'm not that way.
Let me tell you, the word they're spreading is that you have vowed to kill everybody. That it would be a mass suicide. I know it. That's
not even saying.
Koresh told De Guerin that he'd give himself up once he'd written his prophetic interpretation of the Seven Seals. We know Koresh started work because the computer disk containing his first chapter survived the fire. Although the FBI thought this another delaying tactic, it helped persuade them that mass suicide was unlikely and that it was therefore safe to force a conclusion. At dawn on April the 19th, 51 days into the siege, their patience ran out. President Clinton authorized the FBI's tanks to bash holes in the walls, spray CS gas, and fire in gas canisters. Over loudspeakers, the FBI told the Davidians it was not an assault, just an attempt to force them out, but the Davidians stayed put. Last week's report would call the entire gassing operation a failure.
What you had was FBI agents who are trained to be proactive, to do things, to force a conclusion. They didn't have to do something. It's this macho attitude, we've got to bring this to a conclusion, that I'm arguing about. I think the best conclusion would have happened if they just let it happen, rather than trying to force the issue on April the 19th. It was a wrong decision.
6 hours after the gassing operation began, around midday, the Mount Carmel Center burst into flames in 3 different places. About 100 were inside, just 9 escaped. One told me his experience on the phone from WACO prison, British survivor Renos Avram.
I myself went for the nearest exit, which was out the window. I was sure everyone else they sort of panicked, and I could hear quite a few people running down the corridors on the first floor. I myself came out the first floor window. A lot of entrances had already been blocked by the tanks knocking down parts of the building.
How did the fire start? At the time, the government didn't expect a mass suicide, but FBI agents are now hinting they knew the fire might happen. They had listening devices in the building, and early on the 19th allegedly heard Koresh ordering paraffin to be splashed around. The Justice Department won't release those tapes, but its investigator has no doubts.
There is substantial evidence that demonstrates that the fire was caused by those inside the compound. Not just caused by them, but that it was intentionally set. We do have interviews with a number of members who had exited the compound, indicating that there was petroleum-type products that were being spread around the compound, that the fires were set at about the time that that armored vehicles began breaching the walls of the compound. I think the evidence will be overwhelming that that fire was set intentionally by Koresh and some of his core followers.
But the British eyewitness Renos Avram says the fire was started by accident.
I was in there with the time, and there was no proof of any fire to be started or anything like that. I'm not sure if they would know any threats of people from attacking the building. We may have done, but there was no intent of fire starting from the inside.
But as the fire here at Mount Carmel started in 3 separate places, the FBI is probably right that it was deliberate, but there is no proof of mass suicide. The question remains, therefore, whether the FBI was wise to force the issue with the gas attack, or whether it aggravated the situation. The Justice Department report exonerates the FBI, but many in America have received that report skeptically. To avoid an agonizing death by fire, many Davidians shot one another or themselves. David Koresh had already been wounded. FBI agents now believe that it was his trusted lieutenant, Steve Schneider, who had given Koresh everything, including his own wife, who shot the sinful Messiah in the head with a rifle before turning the gun on himself. No weapon was found near the body of David Koresh. A high-velocity rifle lay beside the remains of Steve Schneider. The flag of Texas symbolized the reassertion of state authority over Koresh's kingdom. What little remained of victims of the fire was carried away for identification and autopsy. The survivors and the government cannot agree about responsibility for their deaths. Among them, young Cliff Sellers, John McBean, the Henry family, Wayne Martin, and 4 of his children.
Why did so many people have to die like this? Why did they, when you think that they were in one place, there was 32, and that square place that was over there, it was a pantry. Some of them were so fused together. They were holding each other. There was like 5 or 6 bodies at one point. They realized later that these people all meshed together. Such a heat and such a closeness. They were afraid. They would not have done this. They wouldn't have allowed them, themselves to want to kill themselves like that. They didn't want to die. We all wanted to live. I know my children too.
In order to make his own sort of prophetic vision come true, he decided to stage a fire in which it would make it appear as though this was the result of some sort of armed confrontation between law enforcement and his group. But actually he wasn't given what he wanted, which I believe was an armed conflict between law enforcement and his group in which he expected to die, in which he expected his membership to die.
The shattered mementos of the sect decay on the devastated site of Mount Carmel. Koresh has been demonized by the government and his followers ridiculed as cultists. They became the object of public outrage and loathing, and very few stopped to think about what had happened.
The true test of a free society is not in how it treats its best citizens, but in how it treats its worst, its most despised. And if we can do that to someone because, well, they're religious nuts, or they're a little bit different, or they're a lot different, then we can do it to you, or me, or anyone else. And that troubles me.
What remained of David Koresh was secretly buried here, in this unmarked grave in the small Texas town where he grew up. The Branch Davidian sect still exists. Its members believe Koresh will return soon, and today they are still actively trying to make converts in Britain and wherever people are susceptible to the appeal of a sinful Messiah.